Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel, maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. You know those friends who support your preference for podcasts over music on road trips? That's the energy State Farm brings to insurance. With over 19,000 local agents, they help you find the coverage that fits your needs, so you can spend less time worrying about insurance and more time enjoying the ride. Download the State Farm app or go online at statefarm.com. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry, and as this is an episode in our Vice Presidency series, I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Alex. Alex, thank you so much for being here.
Jerry, thank you for having me, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year to all of our listeners. Hopefully by this point, you're settling into 2026 and you're ready to go on another historical journey with us. So, Alex, before we dive into our subject today, do you remember how we left the last episode?
Yeah, it was a hot mess. And I remember he had to leave the vice presidency.
Yes. So this was our friend Cuckoo Calhoun.
Cuckoo Calhoun, yeah. Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs Calhoun. Yes. John C.
Yes. So he left the vice presidency. This was during the whole nullification crisis, this whole idea of states should be able to nullify federal laws that they didn't like. Calhoun was championing that. And so he resigned the vice presidency, which of course means one thing.
We've got to appoint somebody to take his place. So
we need another guy we need somebody in that seat.
In the seat.
So
pro tempore.
President pro tempore. And the president pro tempore we'll be talking about today is Hugh Lawson White.
Okay.
Now, have you heard of Hugh Lawson White before?
Just the name in passing. I don't know anything particular about him other than the fact that he is from North Carolina.
Yes.
Iredell County, correct?
Absolutely. So, yes, let's go ahead and dive in. Hugh Lawson White was born on October 30th, 1773. He was the first son and second child of James and Mary Lawson White in what is now Iredell County, though then it was part of Rowan County in the colony of North Carolina.
Yes.
Now, we should note that his father James is a historical figure worthy of study in his own right. Born in 1747 in Rowan County, James was of Irish descent, but I wasn't able to find anything about when the family actually immigrated to North Carolina. Now, he and Mary Lawson were wed in 1770, and they would ultimately go on to have 7 children total. In addition to his older sister Margaret, Hugh had 5 younger siblings, with the last one being born in 1789. Now, only a couple of years after Hugh's birth, the British North American colonies would find themselves at war with the British government, and of course, this conflict that we now know of as the Revolutionary War would impact the White family. Because James White was called in service in the cause of the new United States in 1779, and he would serve until 1781, rising to the rank of captain in the North Carolina militia. Now, one source I saw said that he may have served in the Mecklenburg Regiment, which is, of course, from our home county. But I couldn't confirm that without diving down an extreme rabbit hole that would have led us far astray from our purpose for this episode. So if anyone is able to research that, you want to follow up with us, please feel free to reach out, presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. So one can imagine that while James was away in service, it was a challenge to the rest of the family to maintain the household on what was then still considered the frontier. Now, for our purpose, the most important impact was that after the war, North Carolina in 1783 passed a bill that has come to be known as the Land Grab Act, which opened up a large portion of what is now East Tennessee for settlement. Due to James's military service during the Revolution, he was entitled to a land grant, so he traveled through the Tennessee Valley to try to find the perfect plot of land for him and his family. Now, one of the only full biographies that I found on Hugh Lawson White, which was a memoir by Nancy Scott published in 1856, said that Hugh was 8 when he and his parents went to Tennessee. As this seemingly contradicts other accounts I read, it's unclear whether Scott was just mistaken or if maybe Hugh went with his parents while part of the family remained in North Carolina, but I thought I would just note that.
Okay.
At some point, he went to Tennessee. Yes.
And now I've got that song stuck in my mind. Tennessee.
Tennessee.
Sorry. Not Tennessee Jed, but Arrested Development, Tennessee.
Ah, okay. So over the next decade, White would purchase over 4,000 acres, and in 1789, he moved his family from their home in Rowan County to the area where they settled near the junction of the French Broad and Holston rivers. The next year, he established White's Fort. Within 5 years, this grew into a town that we now know of as Knoxville.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So White would contribute to the establishment of this community by donating land for both a town common as well as a Presbyterian church. White would be paid a nominal fee for land on which was established Knoxville's first institution of higher education, originally known as Blount College, but which would ultimately become the University of Tennessee. Yes. Now, we should note that at this point, while what we know of as Tennessee was then a part of North Carolina, there were some counties that attempted to break off into their own state, which they called the state of Franklin.
Yes.
So you've heard of the state of Franklin.
Yes.
And for anybody who hasn't, just go ahead and picture that portion of like East Tennessee towards that eastern point.
Current day Smoky Mountain Park area.
Yes. So while the state of Franklin was still a thing, James White was elected to its legislature. And when it fizzled away, the voters in the area just went ahead and elected him to serve in the North Carolina state legislature.
Okay.
He also served in at least one of the North Carolina conventions called to ratify the U.S. Constitution. Now, while he may have served in both, the source that I found this from only had him listed as attending one, but one of the conventions voted against ratification while the other voted for. I also found nothing saying exactly how he voted.
Okay.
But we know he was involved with the ratification process of the Constitution in North Carolina.
Okay.
So that's our White's father.
Okay.
Now, as for young Hugh, as noted by Scott, quote, he attended such schools as the county afforded during the winter, laboring industriously upon his father's farm through the remainder of the year. He applied himself at the age of 15 to the study of the ancient languages. However, at the age of 19, due to attacks on white settlements by native peoples in the area, Hugh ended his education and, quote, volunteered as a private soldier.
Okay.
On October 17, 1793, Hugh participated in the Battle of Hightower, also known as the Battle of Etowah Cliffs, which was a victory for the Tennessee militia. And of course, by this point, what would become Tennessee had split off from North Carolina as the Southwest Territory, with Knoxville serving as the territorial capital. Now, after his militia service, and likely thanks to his father's influence, the young Hugh Lawson White was able to gain a position as private secretary to the territorial governor, William Blount. Meanwhile,
that's a name I'm familiar with too.
Yes. So William Blount, one of those figures in the early Republic history. He had some scandals as time went on, but at this point, he's still well-renowned. He's serving as the territorial governor, and young Hugh is now his private secretary.
Okay.
Meanwhile, James White earned more martial glory by commanding a group that would come to be dubbed the Immortal 38, which in 1793 defended Knoxville from an estimated force of 1,000 Cherokee and Muskogee warriors. Likely in part due to this, James was elected to the First Territorial Assembly in 1794, where he introduced a bill to create an educational institution in the territory, which would result in the founding of Greenville College.
Greenville with an E.
Actually, no. This is just...
because there's a Greenville with an E, Tennessee. Right?
There is.
Interesting.
But this is Greenville like,
without the E.
Like Greenville, South Carolina. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, though James White was a prominent leader, this did not mean that he was extremely wealthy. When Hugh decided that he wanted to pursue an education in mathematics in Philadelphia, his father was unable to provide him with funds to do so. However, Hugh's brother-in-law, Colonel Charles McClung, that's a name, McClung, came to his rescue and provided Hugh with money to earn his education. Now, after completing his course of study in Philadelphia, Hugh traveled to Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1795, where he studied law.
So where did he study in Philadelphia? Is that disclosed?
I didn't really find in detail where he studied, but somewhere in Philadelphia.
Somewhere in Philly.
Yes. So in 1796, Hugh Lawson White returned to Knoxville and soon after was admitted to the bar so that he could begin his legal practice. That same year, his father, James, served as a delegate to the Tennessee Constitutional Convention, and before long, the territory was a state. So we finally have Tennessee. In its first election, James won a seat in the state Senate, then became that body's first speaker. So his father is this big political force in the new state of Tennessee.
K-pop Demon Hunters, Haja Boys breakfast meal and Huntrix meal have just dropped at McDonald's. They're calling this a battle for the fans. What do you say to that, Rumi?
It's not a battle. So glad the Saja Boys could take breakfast and give our meal the rest of the day.
It is an honor to share.
No, it's our honor.
It is our larger honor.
No, really. Stop.
You can really feel the respect in this battle. Pick a meal to pick a side.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. At participating McDonald's while supplies last.
Now, in 1798, the 25-year-old Hugh Lawson White wed the 15-year-old Elizabeth Carrick.
I mean, I guess this is, before we get into the details, I mean, my God, I know it just seems like so many of these characters that we've talked about before are marrying these girls, and I think back to life expectancy wasn't as long as it is now, but still, it's just, ugh.
Yeah, and to be fair, this wasn't necessarily out of the ordinary. It was how things were at the time, even though, modern sensibilities were like, this is cringy.
Gross. Yeah.
But they were wed in 1798. Now, her father, who was the Reverend Samuel Carrick, had been an early settler in Tennessee and had served as a minister as well as the first president of Blount College. Scott describes her as follows, quote, "As a wife, she, i.e. Elizabeth, was preeminently faithful to all the interests of her husband, kindly caring for his personal comfort, and in his absence, zealously watching over his pecuniary interests."
Mm-hmm.
They would end up having 12 children total.
Ooh, Lord.
8 daughters and 4 sons. Unfortunately, 2 of the 12 passed away in infancy, but, at the time, it was expected. Yeah. But the fact that they had 10 children that lived is unusual for the time.
We've heard of a lot more tragic, not to say that losing 2 isn't tragic, but we've heard of a lot more tragic situations where half of the children, if not more, were lost to illness or whatever.
Oh, yes. Hugh, meanwhile, was on his own rise through the ranks, becoming a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court of Law and Equity, a U.S. District Attorney, and a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court of Errors and Appeals before winning election to a seat in the state Senate in 1807. So, like his father, he's now going to the state Senate. During this session, White worked to, quote, compile the present state system of land laws and procured their enactment. In 1809, White was appointed as a U.S. District Attorney for Tennessee, but he soon resigned that post as he felt he could not devote the time needed to fulfill the requirements of that role. He'd also just won re-election to the Tennessee State Senate, so he opted to retain that post.
Mm-hmm.
White continued on the bench when the Creek War began in 1812, but upon hearing of the challenges that Tennessee militia forces were facing in the Mississippi Territory against native forces there, White and 2 of his associates made their way in mid-November 1813 to the encampment of troops from East Tennessee at Fort Armstrong. Upon learning that communication between the East Tennessee and West Tennessee forces under General Andrew Jackson had broken down, White volunteered to take a message to Jackson. Of course, Andy Jack is going to show up.
Yes.
After a few days through the wilderness, White arrived at Jackson's camp on November 18th and conferred with him before returning to Fort Armstrong. With the 2 forces united at Fort Strother on December 8th, White was assigned to go back to Tennessee to procure supplies and recruit new volunteers, as many of the terms of service for the current militia forces were about to come up. And we talked about this during the Madison presidency series, that, the Creek War and Jackson's prosecution of it. This is that time that everybody's recruitment periods were coming up, and so he was kind of left with nobody. So knowing this, White was sent to try and bring some new folks in. And it was thanks to White's appeal to his brother-in-law, Colonel John Williams, who commanded a force of 600 regular Army soldiers, that Williams secured approval from the federal government to aid Jackson in wrapping up the Creek War with the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. So White comes through, makes sure that he has reinforcements, and they're able to end the war.
Okay.
Now, despite the fact that White had missed several court sessions while coming to the support of Jackson's forces, the state legislature, quote, passed a resolution that there should be no deduction from his, i.e. White's salary.
Okay.
As there should have been for his not performing his duties as a judge. Because he's busy running around trying to help support Jackson. He's not being a judge, but they're like, you know what? We'll let him have a pass with this one. White declined this waiver and stated, quote, that the aid he had rendered was without the hope of reward and that he would receive none. So,
yikes. Okay.
That's, pretty admirable.
Yeah, I've got to say, so far, it's probably too early to make a judgment call, but everything I'm hearing about him, he's no cuckoo for Calhoun.
He's no cuckoo for Calhoun.
Thank goodness.
Apparently, at the end of November 1812, White was chosen as president of the Bank of Tennessee in Knoxville. A later statement asserted that White, quote, repeatedly and earnestly desired that he might not be elected either a director or the president of the bank, but the stockholders have uniformly been desirous to retain him and avail themselves of his service. Now, likely due to the fact that he did not leave his judgeship for a few years after being chosen for this post, White did not accept a salary, but did serve as president of the bank.
Okay.
So he's like, probably wouldn't look good for me to accept a salary as a judge and accept a salary as a bank president.
Again, another admirable decision or action on his part. So, hey, imagine that.
I know, right? But of course, the Creek War, the War of 1812, all that comes to an end. And in 1815, White resigned his seat on the state Supreme Court and began taking a salary of $1,000 annually as bank president.
Wow.
Yeah, which at that time, that was
a pretty decent salary.
Yeah. White was apparently one who liked to beat the morning traffic, as it's noted that he had his, quote, breakfast by candlelight and was in the office at dawn.
Good grief.
You're like, now we're getting a little cuckoo.
He beat the roosters up. That's saying a lot.
It seems that he was good at his job, for in a time of financial turmoil in the aftermath of the War of 1812, for several years, the Bank of Tennessee was the only one that was paying out specie or hard currency for its notes.
Oh, wow.
So across the nation, like this isn't even just Tennessee, across the nation, other banks had stopped doing so in order to avoid depleting their reserves and going under. But the Bank of Tennessee was able to keep on paying out in specie.
Wow.
Meanwhile, White continued on in politics. At this point, the state of Tennessee was run by a faction initially founded by William Blount, but White's brother-in-law, John Overton, was taking control of the faction by this point. Whether this move to enter politics came at Overton's encouragement or from White's motivation as president of the Bank of Tennessee to counter the opposition's growing moves to threaten the state monopoly that Tennessee's two state-chartered banks had, regardless, White decided to put his name forward for political office again. In 1817, he was elected to the Tennessee State Senate and would go on to serve his third term in that body. So he's going back to the Senate. During this tenure, White led through to passage a bill placing $50,000 annual tax on, quote, any banking institution which should attempt to do business in the state without a charter from it. Now, this was aimed directly at the recently rechartered Bank of the United States, which was planning to establish a branch in Nashville. White saw the expansion of this new bank with branches across the nation, quote, as hazarding the public good by encouraging extravagant speculation. He also worried that the bank may begin to exert undue influence in elections. In order to get his bill passed, White came to a compromise, quote, with investors in the outlying towns by which 10 new village banks were chartered. Even this, though, worked in the favor of the state-chartered banks as, quote, it was provided that these petty institutions could become branches of the 2 older banks, which they swiftly did.
Mm-hmm.
So while he's trying to thwart the expansion of the Bank of the United States, he's also working on behalf of these state-chartered banks to expand their reach. White also put forward a bill to prevent dueling in Tennessee.
Oh.
Andrew Jackson won't like that one.
No, not at all.
Because he does love a duel.
He loves a duel. Oh, curmudgeon. No, that's someone else. Anyway.
That's John Adams.
Yeah. We like him a little better than Andy Jack.
Yes.
Quite a bit better.
Yes. Now, sadly, Hugh's mother, Mary Lawson White, passed away on March 1st, 1819, at the age of either 76 or 77.
Pretty decent age for that time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
His father, James White, would last a couple of years longer, but he too passed away on August 14th, 1821, at the age of 74.
So was his mother older than his father?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
Usually the other way around. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Hey.
I'm good. I'm good with it. Hey.
Now, on January 1st, 1820, White's annual salary as president of the Bank of Tennessee was increased from $1,000 to $1,500.
Okay.
Unfortunately, this rise in salary came at a time White also began to suffer from health issues. Though only in his late 40s, White's biographer Nancy Scott noted that, quote, it was feared that he must inevitably become a victim of the dreadful disease which afterwards proved such a terrible scourge for his family. The disease was consumption, which we talked about in Calhoun's episode. Now, luckily for White, it doesn't seem that he was suffering from this particular disease at this point, but we'll just go ahead and put a pin in that consumption talk.
Okay. Yeah.
White was appointed by President Monroe on March 31st, 1821, to a commission established by the Adams-Onez Treaty to settle American claims against Spain. White's fellow commissioners were Maine Governor William King and former U.S. Representative Littleton W. Tazewell of Virginia. White would play a leading role in the commission's work, with his fellow commissioner Tazewell noting decades later that, quote, it is due to Judge White to state that whatever of good may have been done by it, i.e., the commission's work, ought to be ascribed mainly to his patience, industry, and excellent judgment. Now, this work would continue off and on until early June 1824. During this time, White remained as president of the bank, but did not take a salary. So when he's engaged in other work, he's like, maybe I don't need to take that salary.
Again, imagine that.
Yes. White was also chosen by the neighboring state of Kentucky in mid-November 1822 as part of a 4-man commission, quote, to adjust the military land claims of Virginia. In 1824, White was appointed by the state legislature as judge of the Tennessee Supreme Court of Errors and Appeals, but he declined the appointment. He's like, kind of done with the judge thing. He did, however, accept election on October 31st, 1825, to represent Tennessee in the U.S. Senate in the seat vacated by Andrew Jackson. Though it was only a partial payment of 1/4 of his salary, White did continue to accept part of his salary as president of the Bank of Tennessee while serving in the U.S. Senate until he resigned from the bank presidency in July 1827. Now, while White's biographer Nancy Scott made it out that White left the bank of his own volition and that he left it in good shape, the bank had actually been suffering for a bit. The Tennessee State Assembly had put forward a bill in 1823 requiring state-chartered banks to resume the practice of redeeming banknotes for specie on September 1st, 1826. It only took 2 weeks for the other big state bank to close its doors. So, again, this whole, redeeming in specie depletes, especially when economic times are hard.
Right.
It depletes their reserves and they have to shut. So the other big bank closed its doors 2 weeks later. The Bank of Tennessee did a bit better, but according to historian Charles G. Sellers Jr., it finally went under at some point in 1827. So same year that he left the presidency, the bank failed. But to get to his Senate tenure and away from his work at the bank, We need to note that White was entering a capital city in the midst of factional uproar following the contentious 1824 election, which pro-Jackson forces felt had been stolen from the hero of New Orleans. And of course, we'll talk much more about that election as we go along in presidencies. White found himself aligned more closely with the anti-Adams administration faction and would sometimes deliver speeches attacking administration bills. However, as noted by Scott, White, quote, spoke infrequently, saying so much as would explain his reasons for voting, where necessary, or briefly presenting his views upon any subject of sufficient importance. He was not aiming to be another Henry Clay or Daniel Webster, these noted orators and debaters. He was like, you know what? I'm going to make it very simple. Here's why I'm for it or against it. I'm done. So, a man of few words.
A man of few words. I like it. Coolidge would have liked it too, huh?
Yes.
Touché.
Now, one issue that White took on early in his career in the Senate was the issue of, quote, unfair apportionment of the United States judiciary districts. Now, 9 Western states found themselves in the same district, which placed an undue burden on the district judge, with the circuit judge providing little relief. Thus, as noted by Scott, quote, the administration of justice in those states tended to be both slower and more erroneous than in the remaining 15, by reason of the action of a single judge, and of the necessary shortness and infrequency of the terms of each circuit. So basically, he's like, why do we have this huge swath of land that's in the same district?
Right.
That doesn't make sense. After a bill creating 3 additional circuits, as well as 3 new Supreme Court seats to act as the circuit judge in each respective district passed through the House of Representatives, White worked to help push the bill through in the Senate. However, an amendment to the bill passed by the Senate was not approved by the House, and thus the bill failed. White attempted to bring it up in the next congressional session again, but no action was taken on it at that time. Now, as White was beginning his Senate career, back at home, his family was dealing with tragedy.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, you remember that pin in the consumption?
Consumption thing, yeah.
Yeah, let's go ahead and
take the pen
out. Because the White's eldest son, Carrick, passed away at the age of 27 in 1826 from pulmonary consumption.
Oh, Lord.
That would not be the end of it, however.
Oh, gosh.
1827 saw their daughter Lucinda, as well as a daughter-in-law, pass away from consumption.
A daughter-in-law?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
1828 was the most devastating, however.
No.
Now, while I can't confirm, it's implied that consumption is also in the mix here. The Whites lost their daughters Mary and Betsy, as well as their son James, in the same year.
Lord. Absolutely awful.
So at this point, their 5 oldest children were all dead.
Gosh.
Yes.
Whew. That's rough.
Yeah. Yeah, this was a devastating time for them. It was not all doom and gloom, however. On April 5th, 1827, White attended a dinner in his honor in Knoxville and delivered remarks expressing his opposition to the idea of the federal government directing internal improvements in the nation, which he felt was unconstitutional except for extraordinary cases like building a road for military purposes during a war.
Mm-hmm.
So he was like, we don't need the federal government coming in and saying what improvements we need to make. In 1828, White was named as chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, a position that he would retain except for the period when he served as president pro tem for the remainder of his tenure in the Senate. So we talked about the election of 1828 in the Calhoun episode, but basically it was President John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
Given that White was from Tennessee, naturally, he was closer to Jackson.
Yes.
Now, as Jackson prepared to assume office after winning the election, he turned to White to advise him. Jackson apparently asked White at some point if he would serve on his cabinet, but White declined the offer. In fact, White was contemplating retirement from the Senate and leaving Washington altogether. However, Jackson and other friends urged White to remain in the Senate, which he ultimately agreed to do.
Okay.
And of course, if he hadn't, we wouldn't be talking about him today.
That's right.
Before we continue on with his political career, it's time to talk about the Grim Reaper coming to trouble the whites once more.
Oh, no.
Because in January 1829, their daughter Cynthia died at the age of 17.
Gee.
Then, in April 1830, their daughter Melinda, age 15, also passed away.
Good grief.
Again, it's implied that this is due to consumption as well. Now, at this point, taking into account the kids that didn't make it past childhood, I can only account for 3 remaining kids.
Right.
So even though
they had 12 total, 2 died in their infancy, they had 10 left, and now they've lost 7.
Yeah. Now they're down to 3.
Mm-hmm.
Margaret, who was born in 1809, Isabella, born in 1820, and a son named Samuel, born in 1825.
Okay.
So, awful.
Yeah.
Now, it was as chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs that after Andrew Jackson won the presidency and assumed office in 1829, White pushed for the passage of what ultimately became the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
Oh, here we go.
Here we go.
Uh-huh.
Like others at the time,
Yes.
White claimed that removal of the native peoples to lands west of the Mississippi River was the only way to save them from extinction and to allow them space to, quote-unquote, civilize.
My God.
I mean, it's not like they were going to try, say, not taking lands from the native peoples or killing them. No. For your own good, to prevent us from doing that, we need you. We need you to go far, far away.
Jesus.
And
Sorry.
Yeah,
Me.
it's awful. Now, given his role as an advisor to Jackson in the early days of his presidency, it's not surprising then that after Jackson asked for the resignations of every member of his cabinet in 1831 in order to resolve the Petticoat affair, which we talked about in Calhoun's episode.
Yes.
And we'll revisit when we get to Martin Van Buren. The president then turned to White and asked him to join his administration as Secretary of War. Now, numerous folks wrote to White to convince him to take the post, but he declined Jackson's offer. According to historian Jonathan Atkins, White wished to serve, but upon hearing that Jackson would not support any of his cabinet members as a presidential candidate to succeed him, White decided against the offer.
Okay.
So White has presidential ambitions.
You can say that again.
Jackson was none too pleased that he declined the offer.
I'm sure. Andy Jack, cantankerous thing that he was.
But he was, of course, forced to accept White's refusal of the office. He couldn't force him to be Secretary of War, even though he probably thought about, well, maybe I can just grab this gun and force him in. Whatever. I'll just pick up my cane and
we'll
wave
have
it
a
at
duel.
him. I'll wave it at him. But no, he was like, okay, whatever. Now, while neither Scott nor Adkins seem to connect these threads, there may be another reason that White was disinclined to take up the cabinet post. At this point, he was in mourning for his wife Elizabeth, who died of, you guess it, consumption.
Okay, here we go.
On March 25th, 1831.
There we go.
So she had been suffering for a while and not wanting to leave her alone in Knoxville. When Hugh made his way back to the Senate, he brought Elizabeth with him to Washington. They were on their way back home when Elizabeth passed away near Natural Bridge in Virginia.
Oh, my goodness gracious. That's awful.
But wait, it gets worse.
Oh.
Their daughter Margaret heard of her mother's condition and tried to intercept them on the way. Though she didn't arrive before Elizabeth passed, Margaret contracted consumption and died in September of that same year.
Good grief. So now he's down to 2 kids, no wife.
2 kids, a 9-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son. Hugh was also responsible for a number of grandkids who had been left in his care with the passing of their parents.
Oh my gosh.
When
his wife died, I'm sure she was probably the one spearheading those efforts. Now it's on him.
Well, and where they had lost so many kids and, it just awful, devastating.
Absolutely. Good grief.
It would take over a year and a half, but Hugh Lawson White remarried to Anne E. Payton of Washington, D.C. in November 1832. So he did get remarried. White refused to attend the Democratic Convention of 1832, the first of its kind, which Jackson wanted to ensure that his party endorsed Martin Van Buren as his vice presidential running mate in his re-election campaign. So we'll talk about that more in Van Buren's episode. But while White maintained that he was supporting Jackson, he did not want to take sides in the feud in the party about whether Van Buren or the current vice president, John C. Calhoun, should succeed him. So we talked a little bit about that with Calhoun. You know, at this point, he had fallen out with Jackson. He had his supporters. Jackson had his. So there's a lot of tension in the party. And Hugh Lawson White, man of little words, was like, nope.
Right.
When the issue of the recharter of the Bank of the United States came before the Senate in 1832, White came out in opposition to recharter. As discussed earlier, White was concerned about the bank's quote-unquote extravagant speculation and potential influence on politics. So much so that he delivered a 2-day speech in the Senate on June 7th and 8th of 1832 against it. So this is one time that he's like, I've got a few things to say.
Okay.
When Jackson vetoed the recharter bill in July, White again took to the floor on July 11th to defend the president's veto and take on Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. So, as we saw in Calhoun's episode, the bank issue was not the only contentious agenda item that year. A new compromise tariff had been approved by Congress and signed into law by Jackson in 1832 that sought to replace the Tariff of Abominations, as the Tariff of 1828 was called. But the state of South Carolina said that it was nullifying both tariffs and would not enforce them in the state. President Jackson then sought to have Congress push through what was dubbed the Force Bill, which would give him the authority to enforce federal law in South Carolina. So, again, as we saw in our last vice presidency episode, this was too much for Calhoun.
Yes.
Who resigned as vice president on December 28, 1832, in order to assume his seat in the U.S. Senate that South Carolina had elected him to in order to defend their cause in that legislative body.
Right.
So he came down from the rostrum and went and found another seat.
Right.
Now, of course, Calhoun had been replaced on Jackson's reelection ticket by Martin Van Buren, so there was no way he was going to be in office anyway after March 4th, 1833, but he felt the issue was so urgent that he could not delay for the couple of months remaining in his term before making the move. He was like, I need to be down there and delivering speeches and arguing now. Thankfully for the Senate, there was no delay in their business, as Calhoun had just not shown up for the opening of the second session of the 22nd U.S. Congress when it convened on December 3rd, 1832. So they had already chosen one of their own as president pro tempore to preside over the Senate in Calhoun's absence.
Okay.
This was, of course, Hugh Lawson White.
Yes.
So he was already presiding from the rostrum when the news came that he was now second in line for the presidency. Though White would only have a couple of months until the inauguration of the new vice president, this would be a critical time for him to be president pro tem. In this role, it would fall to White to appoint members to new committees, and one was proposed to discuss the tariff crisis and make proposals on how to resolve it. There was pressure applied on him by the Jackson administration to not name Senator John M. Clayton, Whig from Delaware, to the committee, as Clayton was working with Senator Henry Clay on an alternative to the Force Bill, which the administration supported. Now, though White had initially voted for the Force Bill, he was starting to have second thoughts. And he certainly didn't appreciate being dictated to by the president and his supporters.
I'm sure.
Thus, White put Clayton on the committee and asserted with regards to the Force Bill that, quote, having voted for it, I will afford every opportunity to legislation in my power to prevent its effect.
Okay.
So he's like, respect my authority as president pro tem.
Cartman would approve.
Yes.
Yes.
And of course, this act of defiance would not please Andrew Jackson.
Of course it would not.
And thus would begin White's split from Jackson and the Democrats. But as we said, he would only be president pro tem for a few months.
Yeah.
Because March 4th, 1833, Martin Van Buren is inaugurated.
Yes.
And he becomes vice president.
Right.
So soon after vacating the president pro tempore position, White was chosen to participate in a state convention to amend the Tennessee Constitution. However, he declined the post as he expected to still be attending Senate business when the convention was set to meet. When in early 1834, Senator Daniel Webster put up a bill to recharter the Bank of the United States for a period of 6 years, White delivered a 2-day speech starting on March 24th, denouncing the bank as he had in the past.
Okay.
He really had a lot to say about banks. This did not mean, however, any reconciliation with Jackson, for by August, White had heard that the president had said he would actively work against White's candidacy if he chose to run in 1836. So at this point, him and Jackson are through.
Done. Finito. Get the... Never mind.
Yes, that's exactly what Jackson was saying. Meanwhile, if you remember from Calhoun's episode that in 1835, he led a charge and a select committee to investigate, quote, the extent and influence of executive patronage, White ended up being very much aligned with Calhoun's push on this and delivered remarks in the Senate on February 16, 1835, urging reform when it came to executive patronage. White also had words to say about Senator Thomas Hart Benton's motion to expunge from the official Senate Journal that body's censure of President Jackson from the year prior for removing the deposits from the Bank of the United States. White felt that, quote, the Senate had no right to destroy the records of their doings, and offered an alternative amendment to instead rescind the censure. He's like, we can't expunge it. We can't pretend that it didn't exist. We can go ahead and revoke it, walk it back, but it's got to be in there that this actually happened. Ultimately, the Senate would vote to expunge the censure from the record. Now, despite his growing opposition to President Jackson and the pro-administration faction, White was reelected unanimously to the Senate in 1835.
Much to Jackson's chagrin, I'm sure.
Oh, yes. So you can imagine that he was not too pleased about that one.
Good.
Now, White's popularity in Tennessee would put him in a key role in helping to organize the Jackson opposition in Tennessee, which would eventually become the state Whig Party.
Okay.
White would express his disapproval of the idea of abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia in a speech on March 2, 1836, in which he asserted that, quote, we should never permit this place to be converted into a political workshop where plans would be devised or carried into operation that will have the effect of destroying the interest of any of the states. By abolishing slavery here, we not only make a place of refuge for runaways, but we produce a spirit of discontent and rebellion in the minds of slaves in the neighboring states, which will soon spread over all, and which cannot fail to compel owners to destroy their own slaves, to preserve their own lives and those of their wives and children. So basically he's saying we shouldn't abolish slavery in the District of Columbia because that would start a whole domino effect of ending slavery, and we'll probably just have to kill the people that we enslaved.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah,
him and Calhoun. White also felt that the Senate should stop accepting petitions calling for the abolition of slavery in the district, since he argued that Congress had no power to carry that into effect. Why accept a petition about something that you can't do anything about?
goodness.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, with that out of the way,
that's a lot.
You know, he's definitely, for better or worse, he's making his opinions known more in the Senate.
Yeah.
And the closer that the 1836 presidential election drew closer, the more talk of his standing as a candidate for that contest grew.
Okay.
Indeed, in 1833, the Tennessee General Assembly attempted to push through a resolution nominating White for president, but White himself worked behind the scenes to discourage the idea. So he's like, maybe we don't need to do that just yet.
Okay.
This did not deter folks from continuing to work on White's behalf, however. The Tennessee leaders behind White's campaign went out of their way to make sure that everyone understood they were not challenging Andrew Jackson, but rather Martin Van Buren.
Okay.
As historian Jonathan M. Atkins noted, quote, by supporting the claims of an unquestionably pure Jacksonian like White, ambitious politicians and bank advocates could validate their loyalty to Jackson and to Republican principles. So they're basically saying, this guy is Jackson's true successor. He's going to carry forward his policies. Martin Van Buren, on the other hand, and as we'll talk about in his episode, some Democrats had problems with him. They thought that he may be more of, a Federalist, something like that.
Yeah.
Adkins states that many pro-Jackson folks in Tennessee believe that Representative John Bell, Whig from Tennessee, was the driving force behind White's candidacy. While we have no way of knowing, and we'll just have to get Bell's point of view when we get to his seat at the table episode, because he would ultimately become a cabinet member, we do know that there was a concerted anti-Van Buren effort active in Tennessee at the time. White may not have been Bell's first choice, as there does seem to be some indication of his interest in a candidacy for Representative Richard Mentor Johnson of Kentucky. But when Johnson opted to serve as Van Buren's running mate, White was drafted.
Okay.
So the anti-Van Buren folks in Tennessee are coalescing around White.
Yes.
Most of Tennessee's congressional delegation sent White a letter in December 1834 to inquire about, quote, what would likely be your course should public opinion seem to require the use of your name as a candidate for president. Despite his work to derail efforts on his behalf the year before, by December 1834, White was on board, but only if he was, quote, the candidate of the people, rather than a candidate chosen by a convention. So he wants the people, not the party leaders, to say, we're for you. Soon enough, in January 1835, the Alabama state legislature endorsed White, and his campaign was off and running. This endorsement and the strong support that he was receiving in Tennessee led him to be viewed as the head of, quote, a Southern and Western movement offering the opportunity to advance another Tennessean to the White House.
Okay.
So they're trying to do, like back in the day, the Virginia dynasty. They're wanting a Tennessee dynasty.
Right.
Soon enough, White supporters were using the planned Democratic National Convention in Baltimore, planned for May 1835, as evidence of a plot by Van Buren and the Northern interest working in his favor to force him through to the presidency, rather than allowing the people's voice to be heard. He's like, no, those are special interests. Those are the party leaders. They're from the North. They're trying to force Van Buren down our throats.
Right.
Naturally, his supporters felt that White reflected the will of the people and should have equal opportunity to compete for the Democratic nomination. Because Jackson himself had begun his rise to the presidency campaigning about the old caucus nomination process, attacking it as against the will of the people, White supporters were able to simultaneously campaign as adherents to the true Jacksonian philosophy while opposing Jackson's chosen successor.
Okay.
So they're like, that guy is not Jacksonian.
Right.
Even though Jackson's supporting him. Van Buren's supporters, meanwhile, secured pledges from prominent Democratic leaders in Tennessee to abide by the decision of the Democratic National Convention. And thus, when Van Buren was nominated by the convention, they came out in support of his candidacy.
Okay.
Van Buren's campaign worked to associate White with Jackson's opposition, as they felt his candidacy was only being put forward in order to divide the Democratic support so that Henry Clay could win the election.
Right.
Meanwhile, Bell and other White supporters tried to secure support for their candidate in other sections of the country. Unfortunately, the Massachusetts state legislature nominated Senator Daniel Webster, while a state anti-Masonic convention in Pennsylvania, seemingly with Clay's support, put forward William Henry Harrison as their nominee.
Okay.
So other parts of the nation, they're starting to get their kind of regional candidates out. In August 1836, Van Buren's supporters brought out a big weapon, President Andrew Jackson himself. As Jackson made his way back home to the Hermitage, he campaigned in eastern Tennessee, denouncing White as a, quote, red-hot Federalist.
Okay.
Fortunately for White, this effort backfired, as it further proved the White campaign's assertions that Jackson was now just a tool for the Van Buren machine to use for their own purposes.
Yes. Right.
They're like, we know, White, you're what are you talking about, Jackson?
Mm-hmm.
You're willing to say anything for Van Buren. When the votes were counted, though White only won the electoral votes of 2 states, Tennessee and Georgia, overall in the southern states that he was on the ballot, White won 49% of the total ballots.
Okay.
So,
Not
pretty
bad.
good showing.
Yeah.
Indeed, in Jackson's home state of Tennessee, White won with 58% of the vote to Van Buren's 42%. So, it wasn't even close.
Right.
However, with only 26 electoral votes, he came in third in the national contest, and Van Buren's 173 electoral votes meant that he had well over the majority required to become the 8th president of the United States.
Yes.
This, however, would not end White's feud with Andrew Jackson.
Of course it wouldn't.
For in January 1837, White was asked to testify before a House special committee, quote, inquiring into the condition of the public funds. And White used it as an opportunity to, quote, give evidence upon oath of many instances in which officers of the government and those in their employment had attempted to influence public opinion in elections, and made a statement of the part the president himself had taken in the late presidential canvass, as well as his, i.e. Jackson's, attempts to influence him, i.e. White, in his public duties, both while he was president pro tempore of the Senate and subsequently. So under oath, he is saying Jackson is using his office to unduly influence elections.
Yes.
A few months later, Jackson would issue a public response to White's testimony, to which White would reply with his address to the freemen of Tennessee. With this, the break was complete, and there was not to be any more communication between White and Jackson for the remainder of their lives.
I would imagine.
He is done.
Done. D-O-double-N-E.
When President Van Buren put forward the idea of the sub-treasury, which was intended to function as an independent treasury system to manage the nation's money supply without resorting to a national bank, White came out in opposition to it as he felt, quote, that it was putting the control of the whole moneyed capital of the country into the hands of the executive. So even though this wasn't a national bank, he still felt that the president would have too much power with this institution.
Mm-hmm.
White increasingly found himself at odds with the Van Buren administration.
Of course.
And as Whigs began to consider a candidate to run against the incumbent president, White decided that though he would not have preferred him, he would support Henry Clay.
Yes.
When Clay lost out in the party nomination process to William Henry Harrison, White decided that though he would have preferred Clay, he would support Harrison.
Okay.
So he's like, this is the other guy that I didn't want.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really want Clay either, but I'll support him, whatever.
Right, yeah.
Unfortunately, White would not be able to put his lackluster support of the Whig candidate to good use, for in the fall of 1838, his health began to fail as he suffered an attack of congestive fever. Fearing that he would not be able to attend the next session of Congress, White sent in his resignation from the Senate, but Tennessee Governor Newton Cannon refused to accept it.
Wow.
So he was like, no, you just recover. You can get back to the Senate when you can. Unfortunately for White, the Democrats would win control of the state legislature and would attempt to force him to vote for the sub-treasury bill. As White refused, he submitted his resignation in a speech to the Senate on January 11th, 1840. A dinner was thrown in Washington in White's honor a few days after his resignation, and White professed that, quote, at a time when I am banished from the service of my country, without any hope that I can be longer useful to any man, to find myself surrounded by so many men whose friendship and countenance any man in any age or country would justly feel proud of, overwhelms me. Soon afterwards, he returned home, attending a public dinner in Lexington, Virginia, in his honor, and being met with delegations and well-wishers on the way.
Mm-hmm.
His retirement, however, would not be a long one. Though he had suffered from pneumonia prior to leaving Washington, guess what he ended up contracting?
Oh, no.
That's right, pulmonary consumption. After lingering for a couple of days, Hugh Lawson White passed away on April 10th, 1840, in Knoxville at the age of 66, and was buried at the First Presbyterian Church Cemetery. His second wife, Anne, survived Hugh for 7 more years, passing away at their home in Knoxville in April 1847. As she wished, Anne's remains were taken to Washington, and she was interred at her daughter's side. Little bit of a bright moment here, because you'll be glad to know that Hugh's youngest daughter, Isabella, lived a few decades more.
Well, good.
Thankfully, she actually lived for pretty good time.
And what about the son?
So Isabella passed away at the age of 52 in 1872, while his youngest son, Samuel, would serve as mayor of Knoxville and lived until 1860, passing away at the age of 44 or 45.
Okay.
Now, where White's farm was in Knoxville is now part of the grounds of the University of Tennessee campus, and White County in Arkansas is named in his honor.
Okay.
And that is the life and career of Hugh Lawson White.
All right.
So, thoughts?
It's interesting. Wow. I guess he did the best he could with what he had. It seemed like he towed the line in many instances, but I don't know. It's kind of disjointed.
Yeah.
Kind of disjointed.
Well, and he's one of those figures that I would have been surprised if you were like, oh, yeah, Hugh Lawson White. He's not really that well known, but you can see he was involved in so much of the politics of the time. He was involved in Tennessee state politics, and the fact that his father, was a prominent leader as well. It's interesting, but, at the end of the day, what did he really accomplish? Not really that much.
Yeah. The things that he stood for that I did not agree or do not agree with kind of outweigh any of the things that I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's pretty admirable. So, all in all, a disjointed tenure.
I mean, the fact that one of the biggest things that he did was the Indian Removal Act.
Good God.
Yeah.
Yeah, and was completely against the abolition of slavery in D.C. So, two big strikes. I know, product of the era, of the time, or whatever, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he was only, 2 months in the role, so.
Yeah. And that's the thing, it was definitely a critical time to be president pro tem. And as we saw, he did, in that time, have some influence on trying to get through, trying to defeat the force bill, trying to thwart Jackson. So he had, even though it was a short tenure, it was still a pretty pivotal time for him to be president pro tem. But then he was never able to really translate that into, becoming president or even vice president in his own right.
Right.
But, I think there's a lot of interesting things there. Hopefully you thought so as well, that this was an interesting person to look at.
He was interesting. He definitely wasn't no John C. Calhoun, but
no.
For better or worse.
No, we are not going 4 hours on Hugh Lawson White. So, but we'll have to see what happens next time because, of course, we are now on our next vice president, Martin Van Buren.
Yes, Martin Van, baby.
Marty Van. So we'll have to see next time, Van Buren, of course, spoiler alert, becomes president, but his tenure as vice president is also a critical one. And for the first time in a long time, he's going to be a sitting vice president who becomes president. So we've only had a couple of instances of that thus far.
Right.
John Adams, Thomas
Jefferson. Yeah.
And so this is, the third of those. So we'll be back next time with Martin Van Buren, and we'll see what his vice presidency has in store.
Okay.
But until next time, Alex, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. And
my pleasure.
Hopefully learned a little more about Tennessee state history.
Yeah, we did. And some things we wanted to know and some things we didn't want to know, but Whitey White.
Whitey White.
That's my nickname.
That's the official nickname. Yeah. Whitey White.
I was having trouble thinking of one. I was like, Whitey White. Okay. Yeah. Kind of plain, but kind of true.
So, thank you all for listening. If you'd like to see the sources used for this episode or listen to past episodes of the podcast or find out how you, dear listener, can help support the Presidency's podcast, just go to the website, presidenciespodcast.com. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on social media if you don't already. We're available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. And until next time, thanks so much for listening. Stay safe and healthy. Be kind to one another. And take care, dear friends.
You can't reason with the sun. Trust us, we've tried. This summer, it's time to put that angry ball of fire on mute. Columbia's Omni-Shade technology is engineered to protect you from the sun's harsh rays that can burn and damage your skin. The sun is relentless, but so is our gear. Level up your summer at Columbia.com to spend more time outside and less time slathering on aloe lotion. You're welcome. Columbia, engineered for whatever.
Ready to transform your career in real time from where you are? Brown University's flexible online master's programs will help expand your business influence and your network in just 16 months. Choose from management, business analytics, or organizational leadership programs that will prepare you for today's most pressing business challenges without putting your life on hold. Scholarships available. Tap to learn more.